God is so good to us. Amen. We are in Acts 27. And means we're getting ready to wrap up this study. Wow. After how many months? We started a long way. What you have in your, that I've handed out, this is a map of Paul's voyage to Rome. If you look, it's very difficult just taking a regular devotional reading of what was actually happened, how Paul's, we know he got in a shipwreck, and he got shipwrecked in Malta, and we know that, but this is just to, I didn't want to get in the weeds too much, but it's good for us to know and good for us to see what he did. Now we remember in Acts 26, just as we were closing the book, or closing the chapter, that Paul had appealed to Caesar. He didn't have to, but he did. Can you remember why he appealed to Caesar? To go to, just as kind of to catch up. Paul was in Jerusalem because he'd come to report to the church what God had done in his ministry on his second missionary journey. And as a result of his ministry, there were Gentiles that were getting saved. They were becoming converts. And a lot of the Jewish people, even though many were converted, they still had this prejudice against the Gentiles. And they just, as a matter of fact, Paul actually went into the temple. It was at the day of Pentecost, and he was fulfilling a vow that the church asked him to do, to show a sign of unity, so that the Jewish people wouldn't get all upset. So they wanted Paul to show that he wasn't a radical, that he wasn't overthrowing the law and the prophets and the traditions of Abraham and these kind of things. So they asked him to go with a couple of men and take a vow with them. And at the end of the vow, part of the deal was, because it was a Nazirite vow, at the end of the conclusion of the purification, he had his head shaved. And so Cole and I are in good company with Paul. So while he was there going through that purification, a man from Asia, from one of the Gentiles, remember, because on Pentecost and the Passover, it was required that all Jews would come to Jerusalem to celebrate those feasts. It was required, it had been required for centuries. And so while he was there, this man from Asia said, "Brothers, look, here's the guy. He's been turning the whole world upside down." And he started accusing him. Immediately, he incited a riot, and we see how that it didn't take much to ignite riots, especially in Jerusalem. So the Roman soldiers came down from the fortress Antonia. They snatched him up, and they were going to take him back up into the fortress to be, quote, examined, which meant to be tortured. They were going to beat the truth out of him. And he said, well, is it lawful for me to be beaten without being tried, seeing that I'm a Roman citizen? So that, and there were men on the subtext was, there were men earlier on that had made a pact, they swore an oath that they wouldn't eat anything until they killed Paul. And and then the Jews said, well, we need to take this guy back to Jerusalem, or take this guy and set him up to be killed. Well, they took him to Caesarea, and there they had a trial, and the governor said, no, let's take you back down to Jerusalem. And Paul knew that his life was in danger. They were going to kill him or try to. So he said, no. He said, because I'm a Roman, I'm going to appeal to Caesar. I have the right to take this all the way up to the Supreme Court, so to speak. And so we see at the end of 26, after Paul had defended himself over in front of Festus and Felix and Herod Agrippa, and now at the very last three, he says in verse 30 of chapter 26, he says, then the king, the governor, Bernice, and all the others got up and left. And they went out and they talked it over. And they agreed. They said, this man hasn't done anything to deserve death or imprisonment. Sounds like what Pilate said about Jesus. He hasn't done anything. He's not worthy of death. No. Then, and Agrippa said to Festus, he could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. So you see, Paul, by appealing to Caesar, actually was fulfilling the prophecy. It said that he was going to go. Agabus prophesied and said, you're going to go and stand before Caesar. And that was God's ultimate plan, was for him to go to Rome and him to then preach the gospel to the court of Caesar. So, when the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius. He was a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, also was with us. Notice he says, with us. Who wrote the book of Acts? Luke. So, according to the context, Luke was there with him, and he traveled with Paul. And so he says, Aristarchus from Thessalonica, he came, and he came along with us. So Luke is traveling right now with Paul, giving a first-hand account of what's happening. So we left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium. Don't quote me on that, the pronunciation. On the northwest coast of the province of Asia. So they get in a boat. It's a smaller vessel, and they start out in Caesarea, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of your map. So they went from Caesarea, and they traveled up a little ways up the coast to Sidon, which was a port city. And there, when they got to Sidon, says Julius was very kind to Paul, and he let him go ashore. Now, here he's a prisoner. He's a prisoner, but Julius, God gave Paul favor in the eyes of the centurion. Proverbs says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. So many times people say, well, I'm being persecuted. And maybe people don't like you because maybe your character isn't that of Christ. What have I done? You know, and so he's letting him go and visit with friends, it says. He went ashore, he visited his friends, and they could provide for his needs. Remember, when you were a prisoner of Rome, you were on your own. If you were thrown in jail, they really didn't care much about you, so they didn't feed you very well. If it was cold in a cell, you had to hope that your friends would come and bring you clothes or bring you a blanket. And Paul actually, in one of his epistles, actually, I think is 2 Timothy, Paul asked to bring different things for him. And so his friends were ministering to him, were taking care of him, even in the midst of when he's in prison or when he's in captivity by the Romans. God provided for him. So after a little while, they decided they were going to put out to sea again. So from Sidon, what they wanted to do was they wanted to follow the coast of Asia. Because being out in the open sea was very treacherous in those days. In the ships that they had, to our standards, they were very, very primitive. They had oars and they had sails. That's the only thing that was able to move them through and the current of the ocean was the only way that the ships moved. So they started, and it says that they went close to Cyprus. It says they were covered by the island of Cyprus because the winds, it says, the winds were contrary, meaning that they were moving into really a time of the season that the weather was treacherous. The winds were very, very dangerous. But they were determined to go to Rome anyway. And Paul actually, in one part says, as they were going, they went up through, it says, the coast by Cilicia, and then Pamphylia, and they came to Myra. And when they got to Myra, they changed ships. They changed this ship, and they got into a ship that was called, it was from the Alexandrian fleet, which was talking about it. This ship belonged to the Egyptian fleet that Cleopatra actually started. She had the ships built under her reign. It's interesting to me, we hear all the stories about Cleopatra. Well, she had died about